The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, this is Jennifer Schaus, and welcome to week 6 of our government contracting webinar series. We have a total of 9 weeks that we are covering, and every business day, we're covering a different topic on government contracting. Thanks everybody for joining us, and thanks to Chris Shiplett, who is going to be speaking today about avoiding the pitfalls in the SBA 8A application process. As I mentioned, this is a series of government contracting webinars. The full schedule is on our website under the webinar tab. All of the recordings are typically listed the same day below the schedule, and they are segmented by topic. You can also follow us on YouTube to get any of the 50-plus webinars that we've done in the past. A little bit about us. We're based in downtown Washington, D.C., providing multiple services for government contractors, ranging from market analysis reports, proposal writing capabilities, statements, 8A certification, GSA schedules, contract compliance, and additional related services. Throughout the year, we do host events and seminars as well as these webinars. A little bit about me on this slide, but more importantly, I'd rather dig into the meat of our presentation today in the 8A certification process. And Chris, I will hand this over to you and let you dig into the presentation. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Sure. Thank you, Jennifer, and thank you all for joining us. My name is Chris Shiplett. I am a lawyer and the founder of Randolph Law. We specialize in federal contracting law, including in sort of 3 broad areas: these socioeconomic disadvantaged small business programs that the SBA runs, such as 8A, HubZone, Woman-Owned Small Business, as well as disputes with the federal government. This time of year, most disputes with the federal government are bid protests, but we also do contract disputes. And then just kind of your general day-to-day legal needs for government contractors. Today, I'm going to talk specifically about how to avoid the pitfalls in the 8A process. And very briefly, let's talk about what the 8A process is. Now, I'm assuming in this presentation that you have a basic familiarity with what the 8A program is. And so I'm really just going to hit the highlights that are relevant to avoiding the pitfalls in applying for that program. 8A program is very important and can be, after you have been accepted into the program, a very lucrative program for minority-owned small businesses. Most importantly, the application process is a creature of regulation. The entire program is a creature of regulation, and so the entire process and the entire key to avoiding the pitfalls that can come up in that process is keyed to understanding what the regulations require and what the regulations allow. When you download or take this presentation home, copy this next part where it says the regulations can be found at 13 CFR Part 124. Copy that out. There's also a link later on in the presentation, and as you or your company are looking to begin preparing an 8A application, read those regulations, which is something that I will say several times throughout this. Read those regulations. Let me give you a little bit of an example of some of the pitfalls you might run into. This is not an exhaustive example, but these particular pitfalls, I think, really tell the story of how to avoid pitfalls in general, because each of these is tied to a regulatory component. So one pitfall might be that your company hasn't been in existence for 2 years. That is a regulatory requirement. It's not a past performance requirement or anything like that. It's simply that the entity in which the application is being submitted must have been formed more than 2 years before the date of the application. Another pitfall example is if your entity only has one client, and specifically if more than 70% of your revenue is generated from one client, or 70% of your sales come from one client, your application will be rejected. Another example, and this one's a little more squishy, if you will, but it's still regulatory based, is your company would be deemed, quote, affiliated with, let's say, your former full-time employer, which happens quite a bit. And I say, although I didn't put it on the slide, I say, quote, affiliated, because affiliated is a defined term with a whole bunch of regulatory implications. Another example of a pitfall that you need to look to the regulations to figure out how to avoid is if your spouse's income in certain situations is considered part of your income for the income threshold requirements. In certain other situations, your spouse's income is not considered part of your income for the threshold requirements. Now, each of these 4 pitfall examples highlights the fact that you should know, even if you're using an outside consultant to apply for your application or to help you with your application, you should know the regulations. You should read the regulations. So how do you avoid these pitfalls? And I think I've already said it 3 times. I'm going to say it 3 or 4 more times. Read the regulations. I've put up here also to read the SBA website, and when you download the presentation, you can copy and paste this out. And that website, the SBA website, will show each of the eligibility requirements for applying for the 8A program. And then the next website, this, if you take a look at the left-hand side here, this is ECFR. That stands for the Electronic Code of Federal Regulations. That is the government's own electronic database of the most current regulations. And then this entire link takes you to the regulations specific to the SBA program. And when I say read these, this is what I want you to understand about it, is that you need to read them in depth. You need to take notes, and you need to prepare a list of questions if you're going to use a consultant based on your notes, based on your in-depth reading of the regulations. A couple other things, here's what not to do. And I'll work from bottom up on this slide because the bottom one is the most common. Don't rely on what your friends have told you. There, I think, is a lot of received wisdom, a lot of conventional wisdom, a lot of, I have a friend or a business partner or a business acquaintance who tells me that this is how you get the 8A certification. They are all wrong, except when they're not wrong, they may be right about the program 10 years ago, right? The program changes, not constantly, but consistently every 2 years there are minor changes to the program. One great example is 2 years ago, actually 2 great examples. 2 years ago, the 70% requirement that I referred to a couple slides ago went from an unwritten requirement to actually written into the regulations. So anybody from before that would have said, well, that's not in the regulations. Another example is that last summer, the SBA removed the requirement to file what's called an economic disadvantage narrative. And so every new class of applicants has a slightly different landscape within which you apply. The other thing I'll say is don't rely solely on SBA presentations. And it's sort of listen but verify, if you will. The SBA makes a lot of presentations to small business owners. The SBA is not out there intentionally giving incorrect information. That's certainly not what I'm saying. But the SBA, I think many of these presentations are fulfilling the SBA's mission of publicizing the program and marketing the program, which means that the people giving these presentations aren't necessarily the examiners. And so they, may not necessarily be most aware of the specific regulations. The other part of it is that many times the presenters who are aware of the specific regulations are often talking about what the SBA plans to do in the future, which makes sense if you've done 100 of these applications and you can kind of parse out the difference between what the SBA presenter says SBA does versus what the SBA presenter says the SBA is going to do. But if you're a business owner and you've just now heard about the 8A program, you can often take what either your friends say or what the SBA presentations say as the gospel. Take it all as very, very good information that you need to verify by reading the regulations and reading the SBA website. Well, then you know kind of what to do and what not to do. This is the final piece of what to do, and that is consult an expert and consult a couple of experts. And here's what I'm talking about. A lot of times, if you call up an 8A consultant, a lot of 8A consultants will talk to you before charging you a little bit. I mean, their time is valuable and their information is valuable, but certainly I, for example, will talk to people before charging them anything because I don't want to have to refund somebody's money after they've paid me to help them with the 8A process. So you've read the regulations, you've read the SBA website, you've gone to presentations, you've listened to your friends, and now you have a list of your understanding of what your specific red flags would be. Talk to a couple experts, see what they might say about the regulations and about how you might be able to get into the 8A program. And let me give you kind of 3 examples going back to what I talked about as the primary pitfalls and the regulatory changes about what an expert might be able to tell you that's not in the regulations. First one, talking about the 70% threshold. That 70% threshold is you have to have no more than 70% of your sales from one client. But what's not in the regulations and what an expert can help you with is that the regulations don't define a look-back period. Meaning, is it 70% over the prior 6 months? Is it 70% over the prior year? In many cases, it's in the examiner's discretion as to what they consider as the look-back period. An expert can tell you, look, here's what we think you might want to do if you are just at the 70% and you have plans to expand your business or to bring on a new customer in the next couple months. Another example is affiliation, which I talked about, right? Affiliation is a defined term. If you leave your prior employer, and what often happens is you say, look, I'm thinking of starting my own business. Perhaps you've worked in government contracting for a government contractor. That contractor says, you know, we always end up unable to bid on 8A programs. What do you think about bidding on an 8A? Or what do you think about getting your 8A, bidding on the program, and teaming with us to go after 8A contracts? You say, that's great. You end up renting space from this former employer. You end up, because you don't have any work yet, while you're getting on your feet in your new business, you end up subcontracting to your former employer. Regulatorily, that's affiliation. And what that means is that you may not be deemed to have what's called ownership and, my word, complete control over your company, which you are required to have to successfully register in the 8A. But again, and this is where you talk to a couple of experts, there is no specific cutoff date for affiliation, meaning just like the 70% threshold and the question of how far is the look back date, there's a question for affiliation of at what point can you sever all of these ties, and where you were previously affiliated, you now are no longer affiliated. Talk to a couple experts, compare what they suggest in that way. And then finally, to give you another example of talking to experts and talking to people who have done this before, is the 2-year waiver process. SBA will tell you that you can get a 2-year waiver if you have, quote, expertise in the field. I've never been clear on how SBA quantifies somebody who's an expert in the field versus somebody who's just really good at what they do. Many times the 2-year waiver process ends up, or the 2-year waiver threshold ends up being a strategic consideration where you've been in business for 9 months. You know the SBA process is going to take another 9 months. Now you're at 18 months. Do you submit and seek the waiver, or do you wait 6 months and then submit so you don't have to seek the waiver? That type of strategic concern can, if you talk to experts who've done a ton of these applications, they can really help you out with talking about that. Be prepared before you set your pen to paper, and nobody uses pens and papers anymore, but before you type out your first part of the application. And how do you get prepared? Listen to these SBA seminars. Talk to your friends who may have been in the program, your business acquaintances. Verify everything that they say by reading the SBA website and by reading the regulations. Read the regulations with pen and paper in hand, comparing every tiny little piece of what's required in the application with what you have in your situation: personal income, personal assets, business income, number of clients, how many years in business, all of that. Be meticulous about how you compare what's required in the regulations with what you have. Once you've done that, talk to a few experts, whether or not you intend ultimately to have an expert help you. Nevertheless, it's very useful to talk to people who've done this before, to get some of the nuances of how your situation matches up with the regulations. Read the regulations, read the SBA website, take copious notes, be prepared before you even begin your SBA application, and with all of that, you should be able to avoid the primary pitfalls that I see in folks who come to me to get an SBA application. Should be able to smooth your 8A application process and hopefully allow you and your company to be registered as an 8A, and then turn around and take the next step, right, which is start building your 8A business. Jennifer, thank you very much, and everybody else, thank you very much as well. I think I'll turn it back over to Jennifer to explain, if there's questions, how to raise the questions.
Super. Thanks, Chris. Great information. The SBA program obviously is very popular, but as Chris said, please be sure to read the regulations. You can contact him at the phone number listed here, or the email address if you need help with your 8A application, bid protest, or any other government contracting needs. Tomorrow we are covering subcontracting and teaming strategies. Thursday we are talking about the set-aside programs and how to win business under those, obviously including 8A. And Friday, Chris will join us again to discuss the simplified acquisition. So thanks again, everybody. Please contact Chris directly if you have questions, and we hope that you'll join us later this week or in the coming 3 weeks. Thank you.
Thank you all very much for your time.